Its military remained racially segregated when the United States entered World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. African Americans served in every branch of the military, but almost always in separate units commanded primarily by white officers. Despite repeated demonstrations of competence and loyalty, systemic prejudice limited opportunities for black soldiers to fight in combat roles. Most were assigned to service or labor units. The 92nd Infantry Division, known as the Buffalo Soldiers Division, became the primary exception, a rare all-black combat division formed to serve overseas in Europe. Its creation and eventual deployment to Italy represented both a significant step in African American military participation and a revealing example of how racism influenced U.S. military policy, even during a global struggle against fascism. The 92nd Infantry Division was not new to the U.S. Army. It had first been formed during World War I, where black soldiers served under French command due to segregation within the American Expeditionary Forces. After the First World War, the division was deactivated. When the United States mobilized again in 1942, the War Department decided to reconstitute the 92nd as one of two African American infantry divisions, alongside the 93rd. The Army's decision was part of a broader effort to manage growing pressure from civil rights organizations and black newspapers demanding full participation in the war effort. Yet the Army still operated within the Jim Crow framework, meaning that while the 92nd would be sent into combat, it would do so within a rigidly segregated command structure. The 92nd Division was reactivated at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, in October 1942. Fort Huachuca became the principal training center for African American combat troops during the war. The desert conditions were harsh and isolating, but the environment mirrored what soldiers might encounter in parts of the Mediterranean theater. The division was organized along standard U.S. infantry lines, consisting of 3 infantry regiments, the 365th, 366th, and 371st, along with artillery, engineer, medical, and signal units. Its authorized strength was approximately 15,000 men. The majority were black enlisted soldiers, while nearly all senior officers and many company-grade officers were white. Only a limited number of African American officers, often from ROTC programs at historically black colleges or from the Segregated Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning, held positions of command. Training at Fort Huachuca exposed deep divisions in the Army's racial structure. Black soldiers were often denied access to local facilities in nearby towns, faced discrimination from white officers, and endured low expectations from higher command. Nonetheless, morale was high among many enlisted men who viewed service as an opportunity to prove themselves and challenge racial stereotypes. The Buffalo Soldier nickname linked the division to the historic African American cavalry regiments of the post-Civil War era, whose record of discipline and combat skill was a point of pride among black troops. For these soldiers, wearing the patch of the 92nd symbolized not only military duty, but also a continuation of that legacy. Throughout 1943, the division underwent intensive infantry training. Soldiers learned small unit tactics, marksmanship, and combined arms coordination. However, limitations in the training program hindered readiness. The Army's discriminatory assignment system meant that many of the division's officers were inexperienced or unwilling to lead black troops. High turnover among white officers created instability within the command structure. Black officers who demonstrated competence were sometimes reassigned or denied promotion due to racial bias. Reports from inspectors noted deficiencies in leadership cohesion rather than in the performance of enlisted men. But systemic prejudice made it difficult for the division to overcome these barriers before deployment. By 1944, the global situation demanded more combat manpower. Casualties in the European theater, particularly in Italy, forced Allied commanders to reconsider how to use available divisions. The Italian campaign had begun in 1943 with the invasion of Sicily and the subsequent landings at Salerno and Anzio. By mid-1944, the Allies had captured Rome, but were bogged down against German defensive positions in the northern Apennines. The Gothic Line. The U.S. Fifth Army, under General Mark W. Clark, faced severe shortages of infantry replacements. The War Department decided to send the 92nd Infantry Division to reinforce the Fifth Army's ranks in Italy, both to fill manpower gaps and to demonstrate that black troops could perform effectively in frontline combat. In the summer of 1944, after nearly 2 years of training, the 92nd began overseas movement. Units embarked from Hampton Roads, Virginia, and arrived in Italy in late July and early August. Their deployment represented the first large-scale use of an all-black division in the European theater. The division was assigned to the U.S. Fifth Army's 4th Corps under Major General Willis D. Krittenberger. Upon arrival, it was initially tasked with rear area duties, guarding supply lines, escorting prisoners, and constructing roads. These limited assignments reflected persistent skepticism among higher command regarding the combat reliability of black units. However, mounting German resistance soon forced the Fifth Army to commit the 92nd to direct operations along the Ligurian coast and the Serchio Valley north of Pisa. The terrain in this sector was some of the most difficult in Italy. The Gothic Line consisted of a fortified belt of bunkers, minefields, and artillery positions running across the Apennine Mountains from the Adriatic to the Ligurian Sea. German forces, including elite paratroop and mountain units, held strong defensive ground and used the narrow valleys to channel Allied attacks. The 92nd Infantry Division entered combat in September 1944. Its mission was to protect the left flank of the Fifth Army, advance toward the port city of La Spezia, and secure the coastal corridor. It operated alongside elements of the 1st Brazilian Expeditionary Force and the 10th Mountain Division. Combat conditions were harsh from the beginning. The Germans launched repeated counterattacks, and the terrain limited the use of tanks and heavy artillery. The 92nd's regiments, including the 366th Infantry, where Lieutenant John R. Fox would later serve, faced well-entrenched opposition. Inexperience among some officers and inconsistent communication between units caused difficulties during initial operations. Nonetheless, many platoons and companies performed effectively under fire, capturing key positions and holding defensive lines against determined assaults. Casualties mounted, but the division established a stable sector along the Serchio River by late autumn. While the 92nd fought the enemy, it also battled internal prejudice. Reports from higher headquarters frequently attributed setbacks to alleged deficiencies in black troops rather than to tactical realities. White officers were sometimes replaced or reassigned, further disrupting command continuity. African American soldiers, aware of the scrutiny they faced, continued to fight with determination despite the unfair criticism. Among them were men like John Fox, who had been commissioned as a forward observer in the artillery. Fox was a graduate of Ohio's Wilberforce University, an ROTC officer who volunteered for assignment with the 366 Infantry Regiment. His role required him to direct artillery fire from advanced positions, a task demanding precision, courage, and composure under pressure. The 366th Infantry had a complex history within the division. Originally organized as a separate regiment, it was later attached to the 92nd. The regiment operated in mountain villages and small towns, conducting reconnaissance, patrols, and defensive operations against German and Italian fascist forces. The local population in Tuscany often supported the Allies, providing intelligence and sheltering partisans who worked with American units. These conditions created a difficult but dynamic battlefield environment. German troops, including elements of the 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division and other experienced formations, conducted aggressive raids and infiltration attacks, particularly during the winter of 1944–45. By December 1944, the 92nd Infantry Division was heavily engaged in the Serchio Valley, where it defended key approaches against a renewed German offensive. The front was characterized by small villages, stone houses, and steep hillsides, ideal terrain for ambushes and artillery observation posts. It was in one of these villages, Somocolonia, that Lieutenant Fox would make his stand a few weeks later. The deployment of the division to this region placed it directly in the path of Germany's attempt to disrupt Allied lines during the winter months. At the same time, the Battle of the Bulge was raging in Belgium. The experience of the 92nd Infantry Division in Italy exposed both the realities of segregated service and the professionalism of its soldiers. Despite prejudice from within their own ranks and doubts from higher command, these men participated in one of the most grueling campaigns of the war. The Italian front was often overshadowed by the events in France and the Low Countries, but the operations along the Gothic Line were critical to tying down German divisions that might otherwise have reinforced the Reich's northern defenses. The 92nd's presence allowed Allied forces to maintain pressure on multiple fronts, and their combat record, though mixed due to command challenges, demonstrated perseverance under extraordinarily difficult conditions. The stage was thus set for the events that would bring Lieutenant John R. Fox and his comrades into history. The 92nd Division had fought its way from the training grounds of Arizona to the mountains of Italy, enduring segregation and skepticism at every stage. By the winter of 1944, they were no longer merely a symbol of racial policy. They were an active combat division holding a critical sector of the Allied front. Within that battlefield, in the narrow streets of Somocolonia, one forward observer would soon make a decision that embodied the highest traditions of military sacrifice, altering forever how the U.S. Army and the nation remembered the contributions of its black soldiers. By the second half of 1944, the Italian campaign had entered a phase of grinding attrition. The initial promise of a rapid Allied drive up the peninsula had faded. Italy's mountainous geography, narrow valleys, and fortified ridges favored the defenders, and the German army had transformed the country's northern spine into one of the most formidable defensive systems of the war. This line, known as the Gothic Line, was the final barrier protecting the Po Valley and the German frontier beyond the Alps. It was here, amid bitter weather and exhausting terrain, that the U.S. Fifth Army, including the segregated 92nd Infantry Division, faced the test of endurance that would define their contribution to the war in Italy. The Italian campaign had begun with the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, followed by the landings at Salerno and Anzio on the mainland. These operations, though initially successful, encountered strong German resistance. When Rome fell to Allied forces in June 1944, it was hailed as a symbolic victory, but the campaign was far from over. The German High Command, under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, executed a skilled withdrawal northward, trading space for time while constructing a new defensive system across the Apennine Mountains. This became the Gothic Line, a fortified zone stretching approximately 200 miles from the Ligurian coast near La Spezia, across the mountains to the Adriatic Sea near Rimini. The line consisted of a dense network of concrete bunkers, artillery emplacements, minefields, and barbed wire. Built into natural ridges and ridgelines, it was designed to slow or halt any Allied advance into northern Italy. The Germans also made extensive use of camouflage, using villages and farms as fortified positions. By the time the Allies reached it in late summer 1944, Kesselring's army had roughly 15 divisions in place, including elite paratroopers and armored grenadiers. The terrain itself magnified their advantage. Narrow mountain passes, steep inclines, and poor roads made maneuver nearly impossible for large formations and heavy vehicles. The Allied command, led by General Sir Harold Alexander, divided the Italian front between two major forces: the British Eighth Army on the eastern Adriatic side and the U.S. Fifth Army on the western side. The Fifth Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Mark W. Clark, contained a mixture of American, British, Brazilian, and Italian co-belligerent units. It was a multinational force, but one stretched thin, with high casualty rates and limited replacements. Clark's forces were tasked with breaking through the western portion of the Gothic Line to open the route into the Po Valley. The 92nd Infantry Division was assigned to his army as part of 4th Corps under Major General Willis D. Krittenberger. By the time the 92nd arrived in Italy in mid-1944, much of the Fifth Army was already exhausted from continuous fighting. The 34th, 88th, and 85th Divisions had suffered enormous losses in earlier campaigns. The addition of the 92nd offered much-needed manpower, but doubts persisted among senior commanders about the performance of African-American combat troops. These doubts were rooted not in evidence, but in racial prejudice that had long dominated U.S. military policy. Clark himself initially intended to assign the division to secondary roles, such as guarding supply lines and coastal installations. However, as casualties mounted and frontline pressure increased, the 92nd was pushed into combat on the left flank of the Fifth Army. The area assigned to the 92nd stretched from the Ligurian Sea inland toward the Serchio River Valley, north of Pisa and Lucca. It was rugged, forested terrain, characterized by small villages clinging to hillsides and narrow, twisting roads. This sector, though less publicized than the battles near Florence or Bologna, was of significant strategic value. Control of the coastal corridor toward La Spezia would threaten German supply routes and open access to the Po Valley's western approaches. The Germans recognized its importance and fortified every ridge and approach. By September 1944, the 92nd Infantry Division had taken up positions along the Serchio River, facing elements of the German 148th Infantry Division and 16th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, Reichsfuhrer SS. These were experienced formations, well-equipped and familiar with mountain warfare. They constructed defensive belts using stone houses as strong points and laid dense minefields across likely avenues of attack. The 92nd's regiments, particularly the 366th and 375th Infantry Regiments, began probing attacks and reconnaissance missions to test German strength. The first major engagement for the division occurred near the town of Massa in late September. The attacks revealed both the tenacity of German defenses and the difficulties of coordinating large-scale assaults in mountainous terrain. Poor communication lines, limited artillery observation, and unpredictable weather reduced the effectiveness of Allied operations. Moreover, the division's mixed officer corps, where inexperienced white officers commanded black troops, sometimes produced inconsistent tactical leadership. Despite these challenges, platoons and companies of the 92nd fought with determination, securing several hilltop positions and repelling German counterattacks. Throughout October and November 1944, the Italian campaign slowed into a war of attrition. Rain and cold turned mountain paths into mud. The Gothic Line could not be breached by a single thrust. Each ridgeline required days of combat to secure. The Allies made local advances, but failed to achieve a breakthrough before winter set in. The 92nd Infantry Division was rotated through front line and reserve duties, conducting patrols, artillery spotting, and local counterattacks. Their role was vital in maintaining pressure on German forces and preventing them from redeploying troops to the northern sectors facing the British Eighth Army. The strategic logic behind maintaining pressure on the Gothic Line went beyond Italy itself. Allied planners wanted to tie down German divisions in the south, so they could not be used against the advancing Allied forces in France, following the Normandy and southern France landings. Every German regiment held in Italy represented a unit not reinforcing the Western Front. Thus, even as the main Allied focus shifted to Northwest Europe, the Italian campaign remained essential for the overall balance of the war in Europe. By November 1944, the 92nd Division's operational area had stabilized along a front that included several key positions: Fornaci, Barga, Somocolonia, and the surrounding mountain villages. These locations, often separated by steep ridges and valleys, were linked by a limited road network. Control of high ground was decisive. Whichever side held the hills could direct artillery and mortar fire on the valleys below. The German strategy was to hold these high positions through the winter, bleed the Allies through small-scale engagements, and delay any major offensive until spring. The 92nd Infantry Division's commanders recognized the difficulties of their position. General Krittenberger's 4th Corps was stretched thin, with limited reserves. The 92nd's attached units included the 765th Tank Battalion, 473rd Infantry Regiment, and various artillery batteries that provided additional firepower. Among the artillery units were forward observers like Lieutenant John R. Fox, whose job required moving ahead of friendly lines to identify enemy positions and direct artillery fire with precision. Fox's service in this capacity would later prove critical during the German counteroffensive at Somocolonia. While the front remained largely static, the winter of 1944 saw growing German activity. Intelligence reports warned of increased troop concentrations in the Serchio Valley. The German command, aware that the Allies had thinned their forces to support operations elsewhere, planned a local offensive to retake lost ground and destabilize the Fifth Army's left flank. The 14th Panzer Corps, commanded by General Fridolin von Senger und Etterlin, prepared an attack that would coincide with the German Ardennes offensive, known as the Battle of the Bulge, in northern Europe. Though smaller in scale, this Italian offensive aimed to exploit weak sectors and reclaim the initiative. The 92nd Division faced mounting logistical problems as winter deepened. Mountain supply routes were vulnerable to mudslides and enemy fire. Artillery ammunition and rations had to be brought up by mule or jeep along treacherous trails. The combination of fatigue, constant exposure, and sporadic German shelling tested morale across the division. Yet patrols continued to operate nightly, gathering intelligence and engaging in skirmishes with enemy outposts. The men grew increasingly familiar with the villages that would soon become battlegrounds, Somocolonia among them. The Gothic Line's western sector was unique in that civilian populations remained present in many towns. Italian civilians often acted as intermediaries, sharing intelligence on German movements with Allied patrols. Resistance fighters from the Italian partisans also cooperated with American units, guiding them through mountain paths and reporting on enemy concentrations. In this environment, the front line was fluid. Infiltration and counterinfiltration were common. For forward observers and infantry scouts, the danger of ambush was constant. By December 1944, the 92nd Division's regiments were reorganized to strengthen defensive positions along the Serchio River. The 366th Infantry, where Lieutenant Fox was serving, held the high ground near Barga and Somocolonia, facing German reconnaissance patrols probing the front. German artillery fire intensified, signaling preparations for a larger offensive. Commanders anticipated an attack but underestimated its scale and timing. On December 26, 1944, the Germans launched their coordinated counteroffensive. Several battalions of the 148th Infantry Division, supported by armored cars and mortars, struck the 92nd's lines in the Segregated Valley. They targeted Somocolonia, a small but strategically positioned village controlling access to the valley roads. The attack sought to exploit perceived weaknesses in the American defense and drive a wedge between the 366th and 370th regiments. The German assault coincided with poor weather conditions that grounded Allied air support and limited artillery visibility. Units of the 366th were quickly engaged in house-to-house fighting. Communication lines were cut, and some platoons were surrounded. Lieutenant John R. Fox, operating as an artillery observer, took position in the upper floor of a building in Somocolonia to direct fire on advancing German units. His role during this engagement would soon become a defining act of heroism. The battle for Somocolonia represented the harsh culmination of the attritional warfare that had defined the Gothic Line campaign. Both sides had spent months fighting for small pieces of ground. But in this December engagement, the strategic and human cost converged. The Germans sought to prove that the Gothic Line could still hold, while the 92nd Infantry Division fought not only to defend their sector, but to demonstrate their worth as a combat formation under the most demanding conditions. By the end of December, as German pressure mounted across the Segregated Valley, the significance of the Gothic Line became clear. It was not merely a geographical barrier. It was a test of endurance for every Allied soldier stationed along its length. For the 92nd Infantry Division, the fighting in this region would lead directly to one of the most remarkable acts of self-sacrifice of the entire Italian campaign. The decision by Lieutenant John R. Fox to call artillery fire on his own position to halt a German breakthrough. The story of Lieutenant John Robert Fox and the defense of Somocolonia in December 1944 stands as one of the most extraordinary episodes of the Italian campaign. It was not a large battle by the scale of World War II, but within its narrow streets and stone houses, the events of that day revealed the character of a man and the resilience of a segregated unit operating under intense pressure. To understand the situation that brought Fox to that position, it is necessary to trace both his background and the operational conditions of the 366th Infantry Regiment, which faced one of its toughest engagements on the Gothic Line. John R. Fox was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, in May 1915 and grew up in the small community of Ohio's Lincoln Heights, one of the first African-American self-governing towns in the United States. Fox was part of a generation of young black men who came of age during the Great Depression, a time when military service offered both opportunity and risk. He attended Wilberforce University, a historically black institution known for its strong ROTC program that had produced many African-American officers during both World Wars. At Wilberforce, Fox studied mathematics and excelled in leadership training, receiving his commission as a second lieutenant through the ROTC program prior to America's entry into World War II. When the U.S. Army began expanding its officer corps after 1941, Fox volunteered for active duty. He was assigned to the 366th Infantry Regiment, a unit originally activated in 1941 at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, as one of the few all-black combat regiments in the U.S. Army. Like the 92nd Infantry Division, the 366th had deep historical roots. It traced its lineage to earlier African-American units that had served with distinction in World War I. The regiment consisted almost entirely of black enlisted men, but most of its field-grade officers were white, a reflection of the Army's segregationist policy that limited African-American officers' opportunities for higher command. The 366th's initial years of service were marked by frustration. After completing stateside training, the regiment was deployed to the Azores in 1943 to guard strategic airfields and installations. For over a year, the soldiers served in a garrison role, performing security duties far from the front lines. Many viewed this assignment as evidence of the Army's reluctance to use black troops in combat, despite their readiness. Morale suffered, and the men longed for the chance to prove themselves under fire. By late 1944, as Allied losses mounted in Italy, the 366th was finally reassigned to the European front. Upon arrival in Italy, the regiment was attached to the 92nd Infantry Division, operating under Major General Edward M. Almond. The 366th took up positions along the Serchio Valley, tasked with holding critical terrain north of Barga and Somocolonia. This area lay on the western edge of the Gothic Line, one of the most demanding sectors of the entire Italian front. The region was mountainous, cold, and exposed. Villages clung to steep slopes, and narrow trails served as the only routes for movement and supply. The front was not a continuous trench line, but a series of strong points and outposts scattered across high ridges and valleys. The regiment's mission was to defend against German infiltration and maintain pressure on enemy positions north of Lucca and Pisa. Their adversaries were experienced troops from the 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division, Reichsfuhrer SS, and the 148th Infantry Division, both of which had fought in previous campaigns in Italy. These German units had adapted perfectly to mountain warfare, utilizing the terrain to their advantage. The men of the 366th faced not only the enemy, but also logistical challenges: limited artillery support, difficult resupply routes, and poor communication links between companies. Lieutenant Fox was assigned to the 598 Field Artillery Battalion as a forward observer, attached to the 366 Infantry's 598 Battery during operations near Somocolonia. The role of a forward observer was among the most dangerous in the artillery branch. Fox's job was to move with frontline infantry units, locate enemy positions, and relay coordinates to artillery batteries positioned miles behind the lines. He was responsible for adjusting fire based on what he could see from his observation point, often under direct enemy fire. Accuracy and calm judgment were essential. In December 1944, the 366th held a thin defensive line around Somocolonia. The town, perched on a ridge approximately 1,500 feet above sea level, overlooked the Serchio Valley and offered commanding observation over the surrounding terrain. It was a medieval village, with stone houses, narrow alleys, and a church tower that provided a clear view of the valley floor. The Americans occupied positions in and around the town, supported by local Italian partisans who had been operating against German forces in the area. The collaboration between the partisans and the 366th was crucial. The Italians provided intelligence on enemy movements and helped guide American patrols through the mountains. Throughout early December, German reconnaissance patrols had been sighted near the valley. The enemy was preparing a counteroffensive to retake ground lost during the autumn fighting. On December 26, 1944, elements of the 148th Infantry Division began assembling for an attack. Their objective was to break through the American lines at Somocolonia and push south toward Barga, threatening the rear of the 92nd Division. The German plan involved a coordinated assault using infantry supported by mortars, artillery, and armored cars. At dawn on December 26th, heavy fog settled over the valley. German troops used the low visibility to approach undetected. Around 4 a.m., artillery and mortar fire began striking American positions in and around Somocolonia. German infantry, dressed in white camouflage for the winter conditions, advanced rapidly up the slopes. The initial bombardment cut communications between forward outposts and regimental headquarters. Small American detachments fought from house to house as the attackers entered the town. Lieutenant Fox, positioned in the upper floors of a building near the center of Somocolonia, established radio contact with the artillery battery supporting the 366th. From his vantage point, he could observe German troops infiltrating the village. Using his field map and binoculars, he began directing artillery fire on enemy concentrations. His first calls for fire targeted assembly areas north of the village, disrupting the initial German wave. However, as the morning progressed, the situation deteriorated. German forces pressed forward through the narrow streets, overwhelming American and partisan defenders. By mid-morning, much of Somocolonia was surrounded. American units began to withdraw under pressure, while others were cut off. Lieutenant Fox remained at his observation post, continuing to direct artillery fire despite the danger. Reports indicate that he was in radio communication with the 598th Field Artillery Battalion's Fire Direction Center, calmly giving corrections as the Germans advanced closer. His precision allowed friendly artillery to delay the enemy's progress and inflict significant casualties. The intensity of the German attack increased as the day went on. Armored cars and mortars bombarded American positions. Infantry squads infiltrated from multiple directions. The defenders were outnumbered, estimated at less than 100 Americans and partisans against several hundred Germans. Communication between Fox and the regimental command broke down, but he continued relaying coordinates directly to the artillery battery. Around noon, German troops began occupying buildings within yards of Fox's position. He called for fire to be brought closer, so close that the artillery rounds were landing within the village itself. According to after-action reports and later testimonies, Fox's final transmission was made when the Germans had effectively surrounded his position. The artillery command post advised him to withdraw, but Fox refused. He ordered one final adjustment to the fire mission, bringing the impact zone directly onto his own coordinates. When the operator hesitated, Fox confirmed the order, stating that there were too many enemy troops in his area and that the strike was necessary to stop their advance. Minutes later, heavy artillery fire from American guns rained down on Somocolonia, destroying the sector where Fox was located. The barrage halted the German attack and inflicted severe losses on the enemy force attempting to occupy the town. In the aftermath, German troops temporarily held Somocolonia, but their advance beyond the village was broken. When American forces retook the area days later, they found Fox's body among those of roughly 100 German soldiers. His decision to call artillery on his own position had stopped a major penetration of the line and allowed elements of the 366 and nearby units to regroup and re-establish defensive positions further south. Fox's action at Somocolonia became one of the most remarkable examples of individual sacrifice during the Italian campaign. His calm professionalism under pressure and his willingness to give his life to ensure the success of his mission reflected the highest standards of military leadership. It also demonstrated the capability and courage of African American officers serving under segregation, men who often faced skepticism from their own command, but proved themselves in combat. The battle also revealed the difficulties faced by the 366th Infantry and the 92nd Division as a whole. Inconsistent leadership, limited reinforcements, and persistent racial prejudice undermined operational effectiveness. Yet within these constraints, soldiers like Fox, along with countless enlisted men and NCOs, maintained discipline and fulfilled their missions under some of the harshest conditions in Europe. For the survivors of Somocolonia, the memory of Fox's decision left a lasting impression. Italian civilians who had witnessed the fighting later described the American officer who remained behind, continuing to direct fire until the end. Their accounts contributed to the later recognition of his valor. At the time, however, the event passed with little acknowledgement. Reports of the battle were buried amid the larger operations of the Italian campaign. It would take decades for the full story of Fox's sacrifice to be officially honored by the U.S. Army. In military terms, the defense of Somocolonia exemplified the brutal nature of combat along the Gothic Line. Small unit engagements, sudden counterattacks, and reliance on artillery defined the campaign's character. For the 366th Infantry, it was one of many such fights in which isolated outposts faced overwhelming odds. Yet it was this battle, and Lieutenant Fox's final act within it, that became the defining moment of the regiment's service in Italy. The following days saw renewed Allied efforts to stabilize the front. Reinforcements moved into the Serchio Valley, and the German offensive eventually stalled. The price had been high, but the line held. Lieutenant John R. Fox's name became known among those who served with him as a symbol of steadfast duty. A single act that encapsulated the discipline, sacrifice, and professionalism that the 92nd Infantry Division brought to a battlefield that had tested every measure of endurance. By December 26, 1944, the Allied front in northern Italy had become a mosaic of small defensive outposts scattered across mountain villages and ridges. The 92nd Infantry Division stretched along a wide sector from the Ligurian coast to the Serchio Valley, faced one of the most complex and hazardous parts of the Gothic Line. Within this front, the 366th Infantry Regiment occupied the high ground around Barga and Somocolonia, small hilltop towns that served as observation and defensive positions. The German army, under General Fridolin von Senger and Etterlin's 14th Panzer Corps, planned a coordinated counterattack to exploit thinly held American lines during the winter lull. The assault that struck Somocolonia on that cold December morning would not only test the 366th's endurance, but would also produce one of the most selfless actions of the war. Lieutenant John R. Fox's decision to call artillery fire on his own position. The tactical situation in the Serchio Valley was unstable from the start. The 366th Infantry's companies were dispersed across rough, mountainous terrain. Communications between battalions relied on unreliable field telephones and radio sets that frequently lost contact due to interference and terrain masking. Supply lines were long and vulnerable, running along narrow, exposed mountain roads. Intelligence had detected increased German movement in the preceding days, but the scale and timing of the attack were underestimated. The German plan, part of Operation Wintergewitter, Winter Storm, aimed to launch simultaneous attacks against several points along the Fifth Army's line. In the Serchio Valley, the goal was to seize Barga and Somocolonia, forcing a withdrawal of American forces to the south and disrupting their defensive network. The 148th Infantry Division, reinforced by elements of the 286th Grenadier Regiment and Italian fascist auxiliaries, was tasked with the main assault. Their approach would be supported by mortars, artillery, and armored cars moving through the valley roads. At 4 a.m. on December 26th, German artillery opened fire on American positions north and east of Somocolonia. The bombardment lasted about 30 minutes, targeting known observation posts and command centers. The 366th's frontline companies suffered heavy shelling, and telephone lines were severed early in the engagement. In the dense fog of early morning, German infantry advanced up the slopes, using wooded cover to approach the outer defenses undetected. Italian partisans positioned in the village outskirts first spotted the advancing enemy and opened fire, alerting the American defenders. The garrison at Somocolonia numbered fewer than 100 soldiers, mainly members of Company A, 366th Infantry, along with approximately 25 Italian partisans from the local resistance. Their positions were spread throughout the village, occupying stone houses and walls that provided limited cover. Lieutenant John R. Fox, serving as a forward artillery observer for the 598 Field Artillery Battalion, had established his observation post in a two-story building near the town center. From there, he maintained a direct radio link with his artillery battery several miles to the rear. As the German infantry pushed closer, Fox began calling in fire missions to slow their advance. His first coordinates targeted approaches north of the town, roads and paths that enemy units were using to bring up mortars and machine guns. The 105mm howitzers of the 598th opened fire, striking assembly areas and causing temporary confusion among the attackers. For several hours, Fox continued to adjust the artillery fire, directing shells with precision even as German troops infiltrated the lower parts of the village. The defenders fought from house to house, trading small arms and grenade fire with the advancing Germans. By 7 a.m., communication between Somocolonia and the regimental command post had been completely cut off. The Germans, taking advantage of the fog and the steep terrain, surrounded the town from multiple directions. Mortar rounds fell in the village square, setting several buildings ablaze. Despite the deteriorating situation, Fox maintained steady contact with his artillery battery, calmly giving corrections and reporting movements. Eyewitness accounts from Italian civilians later described how German soldiers began entering the village in small groups, using hand grenades and automatic fire to clear each building. American and partisan defenders were forced to withdraw toward the center of Somocolonia. Lieutenant Fox, aware that the enemy was closing in, began to shift artillery fire closer and closer to friendly positions. At first, the barrage landed on the outskirts of the town, then on the streets just beyond his observation post. His last confirmed adjustment before midday placed the impact zone only a few hundred meters away. By late morning, the defenders were almost completely surrounded. Ammunition was running low, and German units were firing from elevated positions above the village. The situation was becoming untenable. Commanders in nearby Barga, unaware of the full extent of the German assault due to broken communication lines, were unable to send reinforcements. The men in Somocolonia were effectively isolated. Fox's radio transmissions were now the only means of coordinating artillery support in the sector. At approximately 11 a.m., German troops began storming the building where Fox had established his post. American soldiers in nearby positions reported that the Germans were within yards of his location. Despite this, Fox continued transmitting fire adjustments. According to artillery records, he ordered the guns to fire directly on a coordinate that placed the impact zone on his own position. When the fire direction center hesitated, fearing the rounds would strike friendly troops, Fox responded with calm finality, confirming his order: "Fire it." There's more of them than there are of us. Moments later, the guns of the 598th Field Artillery Battalion unleashed a concentrated barrage. Dozens of shells struck the center of Somocolonia, demolishing buildings and annihilating the German assault teams attempting to overrun the town. The strike was devastating, precisely targeted at the coordinates Fox had given. The resulting explosions leveled the area around his observation post, killing Fox instantly, along with the enemy troops surrounding him. The artillery barrage effectively halted the German advance in Somocolonia. The attackers, shocked by the intensity and accuracy of the fire, withdrew from the town center to regroup. The temporary pause in the assault allowed a number of surviving American and partisan defenders to slip out of the village under cover of smoke and confusion. They retreated southward toward Barga, where they joined the remaining elements of the 366th Infantry Regiment, preparing secondary defensive lines. By early afternoon, Somocolonia was largely in German hands, but their offensive momentum had been broken. Fox's final fire mission had disrupted their assault formations and inflicted heavy casualties. Reports compiled after the battle estimated that more than 100 German soldiers were killed or wounded by the artillery strike. The destruction in the village center was so extensive that German forces used Somocolonia only as a temporary staging point before pulling back in the face of renewed Allied counterattacks. In the following days, as the German offensive faltered, units of the 92nd Infantry Division and supporting elements of the 10th Mountain Division counterattacked, retaking the ground lost during the initial assault. When American troops re-entered Somocolonia on January 1, 1945, they found the village in ruins. The bodies of both American and German soldiers lay scattered among the rubble. Lieutenant John R. Fox's remains were identified among them, located near the position from which he had made his final transmissions. Evidence from the scene confirmed that the artillery strike had destroyed the area surrounding his last reported coordinates, validating the reports of his deliberate decision to sacrifice himself to stop the German advance. For the men of the 366th, the aftermath of the battle was marked by exhaustion and grief, but also by a deep sense of respect for Fox's actions. Survivors who had fought in Somocolonia recounted how his artillery fire had provided the only effective resistance against overwhelming numbers. His decision to remain behind ensured that the Germans could not exploit a breakthrough that might have compromised the entire Serchio Valley front. Tactical analysis by division artillery officers later confirmed that Fox's fire missions were among the most precise and effective of the campaign, executed under conditions that would have paralyzed most observers. The immediate operational effects of Fox's decision extended beyond Somocolonia itself. By halting the German penetration at that point, he prevented the enemy from flanking American positions along the Serchio River and cutting supply lines to Barga. The delay allowed the 366th Infantry and adjacent units to reorganize and establish a stronger defensive perimeter. German commanders, misled by the intensity of the artillery fire, assumed they faced a larger defending force and halted their advance. This miscalculation bought crucial time for the Fifth Army to stabilize the line and reinforce the sector. Fox's sacrifice also demonstrated the critical role of artillery coordination in mountain warfare. In Italy's narrow valleys and steep ridges, artillery fire was often the decisive factor in halting enemy attacks. Forward observers like Fox operated under extreme danger, with limited protection and constant risk of isolation. Their ability to relay accurate target information determined the success or failure of entire engagements. Fox's performance during the battle exemplified the skill and discipline required for this task. In the days following the battle, reports from survivors and Italian partisans were collected by regimental intelligence officers. Several Italian civilians later confirmed that they had seen Fox in the upper floors of a house directing artillery until the building was destroyed. These accounts were consistent with the artillery logs from the 598 Battalion, which recorded the final fire mission at precisely the coordinates of his last known position. Despite the undeniable tactical success of Fox's action, recognition within official channels was slow. The 92nd Infantry Division's command initially focused on regrouping and preparing for renewed German pressure. Racial prejudice within the Army's evaluation system often led to the underreporting or dismissal of black soldiers' heroism. Fox's story circulated informally among the troops, but was not immediately included in higher-level citations. It would take years, and eventually decades, before the full extent of his valor was formally acknowledged. From a purely military standpoint, Fox's final decision represented one of the most effective last-stand fire missions of the Italian campaign. In small unit combat, such actions were rare. Few observers were willing or able to sacrifice themselves to ensure the destruction of enemy forces at close range. His precision and composure under extreme conditions had not only saved lives, but altered the outcome of a critical engagement on the Gothic Line. The village of Somocolonia, reduced to rubble by the artillery that day, became a symbol of both tragedy and courage. Local residents later rebuilt the town, but the memory of the battle and of the American officer who chose to remain behind endured. Survivors of the 366th and Italian civilians alike would later describe the action as a moment of shared resistance, uniting American soldiers and Italian partisans in defense against a determined enemy. The tactical story of Somocolonia thus concludes with both destruction and salvation. The German assault had achieved temporary success, but failed to break through the Allied defenses. The artillery strike that obliterated the center of the village had preserved the integrity of the front. Lieutenant John R. Fox's name, recorded in the artillery logbooks and remembered by those who witnessed his last act, came to embody the determination of soldiers who fought under the most adverse circumstances, segregated, doubted, but unwavering in their duty. His sacrifice on December 26, 1944, was not an isolated act of desperation. It was a calculated military decision made by a professional officer fully aware of its consequences. Through that act, Fox demonstrated that valor and discipline were not determined by race or recognition, but by the soldier's commitment to his mission and his comrades. The guns that answered his final call silenced the enemy and preserved the line, a victory achieved at the highest personal cost. When the fighting in Somocolonia ended in early January 1945, the battlefield told a clear story of destruction and heroism. The ruined buildings, spent shell casings, and collapsed observation posts were physical proof of the fierce resistance mounted by the 366th Infantry Regiment and its Italian partisan allies. Yet, for the U.S. Army, the significance of Lieutenant John R. Fox's actions on December 26, 1944, did not immediately translate into recognition. The realities of segregation, incomplete reports, and institutional prejudice combined to bury his story for decades. What emerged only after long investigation and historical reevaluation was not merely a tale of one man's bravery. It was an indictment of how wartime heroism was measured and remembered in a racially divided military. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, the 92nd Infantry Division regrouped south of the Huachuca Valley. The German winter offensive had failed to achieve its goals, and by early 1945, the Allied line stabilized once more. For the division, however, the fighting had come at a high cost. The 366th Infantry Regiment, already weakened by weeks of hard combat and difficult terrain, had lost many experienced officers and enlisted men during the defense of Somocolonia. Reports from the field noted the stubborn resistance of small American detachments, including Fox's artillery observation team. But wartime paperwork rarely captured the full context of individual sacrifice. The U.S. Army's system for awarding Valor decorations during World War II depended heavily on eyewitness accounts from officers of equal or higher rank. In the chaos of the battle for Somocolonia, most of Fox's immediate subordinates had been killed or captured. The survivors who escaped to Barga had little opportunity to file detailed statements before being redeployed. As a result, the official record of his actions remained fragmentary. The artillery logs from the 598th Field Artillery Battalion confirmed the coordinates of his final fire mission and its devastating effect. But they did not automatically trigger a recommendation for high-level honors. In the broader command environment of the time, recognition for black soldiers faced additional barriers. The 92nd Infantry Division, the only black infantry division to see sustained combat in Europe, operated under intense scrutiny from both the Army's leadership and segments of the American public. Many senior officers doubted the effectiveness of segregated units and often attributed operational setbacks to alleged deficiencies in training or morale, rather than to tactical circumstances. These biases filtered into after-action reports and personnel evaluations, affecting the consideration of awards for heroism. As a result, Fox's name disappeared into official files after 1945. He was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest decoration for valor. But the citation was brief and lacked the detail typically associated with acts of such extraordinary sacrifice. For decades, his story was known primarily among the veterans of the 92nd Division and the residents of Somocolonia, who honored his memory each year with local commemorations. The 92nd Division itself returned home in 1945 with a mixed reputation. Press coverage during and after the war often highlighted its difficulties during the Italian campaign, sometimes unfairly characterizing the division as ineffective. The official Army history, written in the late 1940s, emphasized command problems and morale issues, but gave little attention to instances of heroism such as those of Lieutenant Fox or other black officers who had distinguished themselves in combat. This portrayal reflected the Army's segregated structure and its reluctance to credit black soldiers with the same professionalism afforded to white units. It would take the civil rights movement and a broader effort to re-examine the role of African Americans in U.S. military history before this narrative began to change. In the 1970s and 1980s, historians and veterans groups began collecting oral histories and unit records from the 92nd Infantry Division. Among the most active was the 92nd Infantry Division Association, composed of surviving veterans determined to correct the historical record. They worked alongside researchers and sympathetic officers to document the contributions of black soldiers whose valor had been overlooked. During this period, the Army began to recognize that systemic racial discrimination had influenced the awarding of combat decorations during World War II. Official reviews of military records showed that many black servicemen had performed deeds equivalent to those that had earned white soldiers the Medal of Honor, yet none had received it during the war. This disparity prompted calls for a formal reassessment. In 1993, the U.S. Army Center of Military History commissioned an extensive study titled The Exclusion of Black Soldiers from the Medal of Honor in World War II. The project, conducted in cooperation with Shaw University, aimed to evaluate the historical record of black servicemen who had received the Distinguished Service Cross or similar high decorations. Researchers reviewed thousands of pages of unit reports, eyewitness statements, and award citations to determine whether racial bias had prevented proper recognition. The investigation identified several cases in which black soldiers' actions clearly merited the Medal of Honor. Lieutenant John R. Fox was among them. The researchers confirmed through artillery records and survivor testimonies that Fox had deliberately called fire on his own position to halt a German assault, resulting in the deaths of more than 100 enemy soldiers and saving numerous members of his unit. The evidence matched every criterion for the Medal of Honor: conspicuous gallantry, self-sacrifice, and direct impact on the success of the mission. Based on the findings, the Army formally recommended that Fox's Distinguished Service Cross be upgraded to the Medal of Honor. The recommendation was approved by the Department of the Army and endorsed by the President of the United States. On January 13, 1997, more than 50 years after his death, Lieutenant John R. Fox was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor in a ceremony at the White House. President Bill Clinton presented the medal to Fox's widow, Arlene Fox, in the presence of surviving veterans of the 92nd Infantry Division and family members of other black servicemen honored that day. The ceremony marked the first time that African American soldiers who had served in World War II received the Medal of Honor, recognition that had been unjustly denied for generations. The official citation described Fox's act in clear military terms, acknowledging that he had intentionally sacrificed his life by calling for artillery fire on his own position in order to destroy the enemy and protect his unit. The text reflected both the tactical precision and moral weight of his decision. For many veterans of the 92nd Division, the moment represented long overdue validation, not only for Fox, but for the thousands of black soldiers who had served under difficult and often unequal conditions. The Medal of Honor review also drew attention to the broader combat record of the 92nd Infantry Division. Historians re-examined previously critical assessments of the unit's performance, noting that the division had been assigned some of the most difficult sectors of the Italian front, often with inadequate support. In many cases, its setbacks had stemmed from command instability and insufficient reinforcements, rather than from lack of courage or discipline among its troops. Reports from Allied officers who served alongside the 92nd confirmed that its soldiers fought with determination under severe conditions. Italian sources further reinforced this view. Civilians in the Serchio Valley and former partisans who had fought with the Americans consistently recalled the bravery of black soldiers in defending their villages against German counterattacks. In Somocolonia, the memory of Fox's sacrifice remained particularly strong. Local residents, who had rebuilt their town from the ruins of the 1944 battle, erected a memorial stone in his honor. Each year, on December 26th, the community holds a ceremony to commemorate his actions and those of the Italian and American soldiers who died in the defense of the village. Fox's legacy extended beyond the battlefield into the transformation of the U.S. military itself. His service occurred in an era when segregation was official policy. African American units were often relegated to support roles or used as test cases in combat. Yet, less than 3 years after his death, President Harry S. Truman's Executive Order 9981 of 1948 mandated the desegregation of the armed forces, laying the groundwork for a new generation of integrated military service. The heroism of men like Fox provided tangible evidence that the color of a soldier's skin bore no relation to his courage or professionalism. Within military education circles, Fox's story became a case study in leadership and tactical decision-making. The U.S. Army War College and the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill incorporated his actions into discussions of forward observation and fire control under pressure. His decision to remain at his post despite certain death illustrated the highest standard of command responsibility. Modern field manuals referencing historical examples often cite Fox's final mission as an example of decisive, selfless leadership in combat. By the early 2000s, additional honors followed. Streets, buildings, and military facilities were named in his memory. The Lieutenant John R. Fox Armory in Massachusetts, near his birthplace of Cincinnati, Ohio, stands as one of several dedications recognizing his contribution. The U.S. Army also included his story in official heritage programs highlighting African American achievements in military history. For historians, Fox's recognition also helped challenge outdated interpretations of the 92nd Infantry Division's wartime role. The reevaluation led to a more balanced understanding of the challenges faced by segregated units, ranging from systemic prejudice to uneven command structures, and the ways in which those soldiers nonetheless fulfilled their missions. The archival work surrounding Fox's Medal of Honor case became part of a broader effort to integrate the contributions of African American servicemen into the mainstream narrative of World War II. Beyond the military, his example influenced public awareness of racial equality and heroism. Documentaries, academic studies, and exhibitions on African Americans in World War II frequently center on Fox as a symbol of patriotism untainted by resentment. His decision to call fire on his own position, carried out without hesitation or bitterness despite serving in a segregated army, represented a profound moral statement. He had fought for a country that did not yet treat him as equal, but he fulfilled his duty with complete conviction. The final decades of the 20th century thus transformed Fox's memory from an obscure wartime footnote into a cornerstone of American military heritage. His Medal of Honor did more than correct a historical oversight. It publicly affirmed that the measure of valor transcends social barriers. His legacy became intertwined with that of the 92nd Infantry Division and the countless black soldiers whose service contributed to Allied victory despite systemic injustice. Today, the name John R. Fox stands alongside those of other Medal of Honor recipients whose actions defined courage in its purest military form. The artillery coordinates he gave on that winter morning in 1944 not only destroyed an enemy assault, they marked a point in history where individual valor overcame institutional discrimination. From the ruins of Somocolonia to the halls of the White House, his story reflects both the human cost of war and the long struggle for recognition within the nation he served. Lieutenant Fox's sacrifice secured a tactical victory in a small Italian village, but its legacy achieved something larger. The vindication of a generation of soldiers who fought for democracy abroad while facing inequality at home. Through his final act, he demonstrated that courage, loyalty, and leadership were not defined by circumstance, but by choice. In honoring him decades later, the United States finally acknowledged what his comrades and the people of Somocolonia had known since 1944. That his decision on that day was not only a soldier's duty, but an enduring testament to valor beyond segregation.